Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Moser, professor of history and co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. Welcome to our second season of Documents in Detail, teachingamericanhistory.org's webinar series. In each episode, we're doing a deep dive into a single document, discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of said document, while also analyzing its impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. To help us begin to think about the topics of this year's webinars, we are drawing speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database available at tah.org. And you too can participate in the discussion by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time. I will do my best to monitor those questions and pass them along to the speakers. The subject of today's program is Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. To help discuss it, we are proud to have Dr. Jay Green, professor of history at Covenant College, and Dr. Lucas Morell, professor of politics at Washington and Lee University. Jay, Lucas, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you.
So let me start with a very general question. Why is this speech regarded as such a classic in American political rhetoric? Why is it included in almost every document reader you can find on 20th century America?
Well, the short version is that next to Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail gives, a 7,000-word explanation of how he sees the civil rights movement achieving its gains through nonviolence and civil disobedience. So it's unlike a speech. We're used to King giving speeches. This is something that he began writing in jail, obviously, and then with the help of a few editors, actually turned it into a very coherent, lucid, and systematic explanation of his theory of nonviolence, nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. I don't think there's anything better that was written in the 20th century.
All right, Jay?
I think that, well, for one, I Have a Dream is currently regarded as maybe the most widely known American document in American history. There was a poll conducted in 2008 that found that as far as recognition of the author and the content of the speech, and at least the title, it registered at about 97% recognition. So it's certainly marks the most visible, most widely shared of his speeches in the moment. With the Washington, it was kind of the high point of the March on Washington in August of 1963, and televised on, I think, all of the networks, and gave maybe the widest reach at the moment to sort of the cause of civil rights, and was being used at the time to put forward not just rhetoric about civil rights, but more importantly, some legislation. So in that respect, all kinds of things came together, and we can talk in a little bit about the rhetorical power of the speech, but certainly it has, it resonates more than, it's more associated with King than any other speech that he gave in his life.
That's fascinating. What you mentioned about 97% recognition. This coming after a week in which we learned that roughly a third of millennials could not identify what the Holocaust was.
Right.
This is pretty impressive. maybe I could ask each of you to speak a little bit about the context for this speech. What specifically is he is King reacting to? What's the importance of this historical moment?
I guess I should start by correcting myself. I gave you a quick opening on a different word by King, and Jay was too polite to correct me. He allowed me to stand corrected. I was talking about the letter from Birmingham jail. I have a dream speech, as Jay noted, took place in August of '63, August 28th to be precise. And it was a march that was trying to draw attention to the lack of jobs and freedom as the button that King and many of the marchers wore said. And it's happening during a summer where Congress is filibustering a civil rights bill that Kennedy finally got around to moving on. And in fact, the only photograph we have of King and X, as I know it, is a picture of them both smiling in a hallway of Congress as they were trying to listen in on the debates over the Civil Rights Bill in '63 that eventually will become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it's happening that summer where it looks like there's no progress going to be made on civil rights, to put more teeth into previous civil rights acts like 57 and 60. It's, they originally planned, as I understand it, to try to have this done actually at the Capitol steps because that's where the laws are made. But then for some reason, they decided to move it to the footsteps of the Lincoln Memorial. And that's, of course, where King, the springboard for King's speech is echoes what Lincoln did to emancipate slaves in 1863.
Jay, care to add anything to that?
Sure. I think we live in an age where it is so common for groups to gather in Washington to march for a cause that maybe we look back on this as not very significant for 250,000 people to gather. This was by far and away the greatest gathering for any single cause of any sort in Washington, D.C., and was kind of the first that set the standard for this going forward. A. Philip Randolph organized the march with Bayard Rustin, but the interesting thing is that they had been talking about a concerted march on Washington for African Americans to argue for the need for desegregation since the 1940s. And FDR in 1941 held them off by issuing Executive Order 8802 that desegregated the armed forces and other parts of the federal government. But the idea of a march on Washington was still very much in their minds. And so this was the culmination of more than 20 years of work by Randolph and Bayard. And it really brought together, we have CORE, we have SNCC, the Southern Conference on Leadership, the NAACP, the National Urban League, all are coming together in really what might be, many regard this as the high point because there were so many splinterings of the civil rights movement that really follow this, but in all kinds of ways, the stars aligned, people came together and really, and then with King, sort of the high point of the event. And as we see after August of '63, the civil rights movement went in a lot of different directions.
Sure. So this is really the first major civil rights march, you would say.
Well, in Washington.
In Washington. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing to note is most people thought that you could not gather 50,000, let alone 250,000 Black and white people in the same place without riots breaking out. So if I'm not mistaken, either the National Guard or the United States military was actually stationed around the city. And a lot of people were told, don't go downtown. If you have any business, do it some other day because we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense for what percentage of those in the crowd were white?
I do not.
It was it was small based on the photographs. I mean, there were a lot of white folks who wanted to be involved and were helping organize. So it wasn't insignificant, but it was by far and away majority African American. Just one more point on the level of concern in Washington D.C. on that day. Hospitals forbid elective surgery at the prospect of there being massive riots and the hospitals filled with injured people. The Washington Senators delayed their game by a couple of days until the march was safely over. And there was just genuinely a lot of anxiety because, as Lucas said, no one had ever seen this happen before, and no one was sure how it was going to come together. So that's another thing that makes the march pretty remarkable, because it was a very peaceable event.
I assume then that the king was not the only speaker. Did all the speakers that day more or less share the same message as King?
You're right. There were multiple speakers. I'm trying to remember how many. There were at least a dozen, and I know they kind of. It was an August day in Washington, and there was some concern that even though they were ahead of schedule by the time King took the podium, that people were getting hot and people were getting restless. But all the speakers were male. That was one thing notable. They weren't all African American. For instance, Walter Reuther, labor leader, was one of the speakers. You could see fissures within the civil rights movement, even among the speeches. Probably the most controversial speech of the day was by a young John Lewis, today Congressman Lewis from SNCC, and his speech was, in its original draft, was extraordinarily strident and created a lot of worry about what would be the result. So his went through several revisions, and he finally relented and eased some of the language.
Okay, Lucas, you have anything more on that?
No, it's just as he says. There weren't just speeches, right? There were songs sung. Mahalia Jackson, without question, the most famous Black gospel singer of the mid 20th century, was there. I believe Joan Baez was there. So it was not just speeches, but there were also performances. It was a long day.
Okay. Well, let's turn to King's rhetoric. What do you find so striking about the language that King uses in this address?
One of the reasons for this speech at this particular time, it was intended to mark the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Came a little bit later, but 1963, that was very much on the minds of the marchers. And King, right off the bat, is evoking 100 years before. He starts out, 50 years ago, and that language is obviously meant to evoke Gettysburg. And he immediately is calling on sort of the moral authority of standing at this very extraordinary spot with Lincoln sort of at his back, and moves on to sort of establish that the basis of his speech is going to be the legacy of emancipation, and the degree to which the legacy of emancipation could be envisioned as success, bringing the success that it might have been hoped for at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation or not. And so I think that part is very striking.
Okay. Lucas.
Yeah. When I teach this speech, the students pick up on two major strains of allusions or references that King makes, and one is political and the other is religious. It makes sense because you've got a preacher giving a speech there. No doubt he's going to make some allusions to the Bible, but he also is keen that he's speaking in the nation's capital and speaking to a national audience, and he's going to employ rhetoric that essentially invites the American people to say yes to what they have for centuries have professed to believe in. So it's a real moment of challenge, but in a way that should be welcomed. I mean, essentially, King is preaching out of America's own political hymnal. So presumably the principles that he touches, and then in broad strokes, any policies he tries to draw from that, He thinks he's going to or should receive a very welcome audience. After all, we got to remind ourselves with this civil rights bill being filibustered, you got to get a lot of white people to see that what a black minority in America is asking for is something that they should not be able to begrudge. They're only asking for what whites have already been saying any American citizen should have. In fact, King takes civil out of civil rights and uses a noun. He uses the noun citizenship to remind people this is what civil rights means. Civil rights doesn't mean what, handouts to black people. Civil rights means the rights that any American citizen, regardless of race, creed, color, what have you, is owed and what they deserve by their state government and the national government. So when you think about a Congress that's actually debating this bill, there are no black senators in 1963, zero. So you need to get 50% plus one of senators to agree that something that is going to be passed that helps black people is something that helps all of America. And there are very few blacks in the House of Representatives. I don't know the exact number, but let's just say it's less than half, like way less than half. So King knows in order to get progress legally, he has to get progress from the lawmakers, very few of whom look like him. And so he's got to speak a language that all Americans presumably have been speaking for a long time and are familiar with.
Is it fair to say then that this is we could call this a conservative speech?
Well,
Jay, you want to crack that one first?
Yeah, I don't know. I would say David Blight has a really wonderful book on the memory of the Civil War and the various competing narratives that had dominated the. He focuses on the first 50 years, but really that the way that the legacy of the Civil War is told multiple different ways. And I will say, whether you regard it as conservative or not, King was doing something here that it's hard for modern ears to hear, and it is the narrative that links Lincoln with emancipation, with the legacy of freeing the slaves, and that the Civil War was about slavery, was not something that most people took for granted. So in all kinds of important ways, I think I think King is giving kind of a history lesson. He's re-narrating American history in ways that would have probably been almost shocking to everyone except the African Americans in the audience, who really never abandoned this emancipationist idea. So in that respect, it might be common for us to associate, yes, Lincoln as the great emancipator, Lincoln as the freer of slaves. That was not what Lincoln's association with. I was reading about the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in 1922. Slavery was almost not mentioned at all. What was mentioned was the importance of reconciliation and how Lincoln was a friend of the Southern man. And for King to stand up in this very spot and tell the story of American history that emphasizes first emancipation, but also the broken promises of, well, essentially the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, was really had to have been somewhat shocking, and I wouldn't necessarily call that conservative.
This is very interesting because, of course, not only is it 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, but a good part of the country would have been observing the 100 years anniversary of the Civil War. So I imagine there would have been an outpouring of lost cause mythology about the Confederacy during the same period, which might help to explain why the Confederate battle flag is making its appearance on state flags in many parts of the South during these years. Lucas, do you care to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think it can be classified both as conservative and liberal. The liberal part is the part that he closes with, "Let freedom ring," right? So there's nothing more liberal than freedom. But the speech tells us what his chief touchstones are going to be. One is an American president who, in every poll, is either rated number one or number two. It's like he he and George Washington are the K2 and Mount Everest of American presidents. So it reaches back to Lincoln, it reaches back to the Emancipation Proclamation, but then it goes all the way back to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And so King is, as I say, implicitly challenging Americans to live up to what, as he puts it in another speech, we just want you to live up to what you put down on paper, right? If they'd ever said all men are created equal, or if they amended that and said all white men, or all white men descended from, England or Western Europe, we would be having, and King would be having a very different conversation. But I think King believes he's presenting something that shouldn't be too threatening to his audience, precisely because he's holding up for them the mainstays of their political life, namely the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If Americans want to argue with King over that, I think that would be a very big problem. I don't think anybody is scoring a lot of points by burning copies of the Declaration or the Constitution in 1963.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions from our participants. This one comes from Joe Rooney. It seems to me that the most memorable part of the speech, the "I have a dream" closing, is actually the least important part, with the most important part being the illusion of coming to cash the check of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Do either of you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would agree. I think certainly the end of the speech is the most rhetorically powerful, and kind of famously wasn't in. That's the part he kind of did extemporaneously, and certainly the more quotable parts come from that. But I would agree, and I agree with Lucas's take about conservative to the extent that he was merely calling on Congress, who's. I think there's also something to be said. Maybe that was his primary audience for the speech, but Americans more broadly, to merely make good on these promises. But he turns within that, and I think these are other really important parts of the speech where he is. I think there were some who thought King was being co-opted and being kind of softened by his being too close to power. And in the paragraph where he talks about the hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now, this language of now had a radical tone to it. He talks about the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. That is that's a reference even back to the project of decolonization, where there was an eagerness on the part of colonial powers to say, eventually in good time, you just need to be patient. And the time for patience, he was saying, had run out. So there was an urgency and a more specific kind of message he was sending that I think the flowery language toward the end is certainly not as specific or directed.
Yeah, I think that's well put, Jay. And I would just add that the reason why King mentions not just the fierce urgency of now, because justice delayed is justice denied, as he'd said other times, but also he's contending against another popular black figure by the name of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X has a very strong appeal precisely because his language isn't, shall we say, soft, isn't conservative, isn't polite, if you will. His is a language of justice, and it's a language of militancy. And King recognizes, especially among the younger marchers and those that he's getting to know, guys like John Lewis, who are putting their lives literally on the line. John Lewis is doing everything he can to keep the SNCC, the Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, from being co-opted by what will become the Black Power movement led by Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture. This is borne out in the next couple of years. And so King is, in a way, trying to say, look, you're better off dealing with me than dealing with those cats over there. I mean, those cats could care less about America. They're not singing Christian songs. They're not singing "We Shall Overcome." They don't have time for that. And so King has to address that concern by saying, look, you can avoid that extreme by adopting my posture, as it were. But there's a paragraph where he says that we shouldn't drink from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Creative protest shouldn't degenerate into physical violence. We have to meet physical force with soul force. King is still making the claim, and he does it till the day he dies. He's still making the claim that if we want what he calls the beloved community at the end of all this, we have to be loving in our means. Our means have to be consistent with our end. And so he doesn't want, especially young blacks, to grow hateful towards all whites, as it were, and hateful towards this country. He thinks that's a losing proposition.
How much of a following does Malcolm X have at this point?
Oh, I can't give you gross numbers there. They're popular primarily in urban cities like Chicago, New York, LA. In 63, of course, is the peak of Malcolm's influence. He's going to be basically run out of the organization, the Nation of Islam, in early 64 because of things that X knows about Elijah Muhammad, the leader, that are not quite proper.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that they're even though they were big enough for the FBI to care,
Yeah.
but not big enough to overthrow this country, and that's a understatement.
Yeah. And well, a little bit later, big enough to terrify Muhammad Ali, right? It was,
Yeah.
Okay. Well, did Malcolm X have any official reaction to this speech? Did he make any kind of response?
Oh yeah. He loved, and Malcolm X has the gift of gab without question. He was a natural, also well read, but he was a natural rhetorician. He called the March on Washington the farce on Washington, especially when news got out that, for example, John Lewis's speech had to be vetted by the White House before they essentially allowed it to be delivered. I mean, X does not believe that working with whites is a solution. He doesn't believe that when he's a member of the Nation of Islam, and he doesn't believe it for the most part when he leaves the Nation of Islam. He thinks the priority has to be blacks, helping blacks, coming up with their own leaders, funding their own movement. He wants black solidarity before he reaches out for the popular phrase today, allies. He thinks there's very little, especially, in fact, he thinks there's nothing whites can offer blacks in the United States, at least at the outset. Blacks have to get their act together, and they do that by, in fact, ignoring any of their religious affiliations, any of their political affiliations, any of their fraternal associations. He says, if you're black in this country, you are a victim of America. You're not a citizen of America. And so King was, he was definitely paying attention to what's being said in Washington, and he counts it. He's proud of the fact that he was, as it were, not invited. He was not going to be co-opted.
Okay. Jay, care to add to that?
Yeah, I think another one of the more immediate contexts for this speech was in June. There was, if I'm remembering right, the desegregation or the kind of the forced desegregation of the University of Alabama, followed quickly by President Kennedy going on national TV and laying out his commitment to civil rights legislation and his support for what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But immediately after that was that very same night was the murder of Medgar Evers. And I think that and that's referenced several times among the speeches. That's very much on people's minds. And there's a level and a rising level. And of course, immediately following the March on Washington, within a month, there would be further the bombings of the 16th Street church in Birmingham. And just there was reason for anxiety and a fair degree of this background that explains the rising tide of stridency and an unwillingness to sort of think that this kind of event's really going to do much of anything.
Okay. Dan Farrar asks how you would go about contrasting King's speech to the rhetoric of Malcolm X. I think we touched on that to a certain extent already. Which one resonated more with the black community at this time?
Well, that's hard to say, and I think one thing that I picked up in preparation for thinking about this was the wonderful autobiography by Anne Moody, Coming of Age in Mississippi, and you get really there's been some complaints among some historians of the civil rights that really too much of a focus on leaders fails to recognize really what was resonating and what wasn't in the rank and file. And I'll tell you, Ann Moody was driven from Mississippi by a white pastor and his wife, and she was singularly unimpressed with King. There was nothing about it. She wasn't moved. She said, I thought we had, I went there looking for leaders and I found dreamers. So and I don't know that, I'm not saying that she was representative, but I think it would be a mistake to assume that people were thinking about these things with a single voice. I know that merely having this number of African Americans gathered in this place, regardless of who was speaking, was a great source of pride and hope. Who they were specifically rooting for or identifying with, I'm not so sure.
Lucas.
Yeah, I would say, without actually, I don't know if Gallup was polling this, but one of the leading magazines that catered to Black Americans was called Jet magazine. And in the 50s and 60s, they would poll their readers and ask, who speaks for you? Who's your favorite? Who are you praying for at night? And through the 50s, it was Thurgood Marshall. Before he was Solicitor General, before he was the first Black justice on the Supreme Court, he was lead counsel for the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. And he, brick by brick, was attempting to dismantle segregation, sometimes at great risk to his own life, going from courthouse to courthouse in the South. And Thurgood Marshall in the 50s, Blacks knew who he was, even though he did his work behind closed doors, right? We didn't have cameras film cameras in courthouses, whereas King was out in the open, something, in fact, that Thurgood Marshall kind of complained about. He said, we're doing the real work here. We're changing laws. We're winning cases. And in a way, you're getting all the pub, all the publicity. We know about King rising to the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association at a very young age and leading a boycott that took over a year. But that boycott came to an end, not because of a successful boycott, but because of a successful court case. And so Marshall, for his own, in his own opinion, didn't like the fact that King was actually making open air demonstrations, giving that a good name, rehabilitating something that was usually associated with, as it were, the hoi polloi or the lower class. King was getting people dressed to the nines to march. These were upper class, middle class people like himself. And anyway, so what happens is in the early 60s, when King comes to the foreground more, when the New York Times is paying attention, there is a shift, at least in the subscribers of that magazine. It's not until the early 60s does King rise to the top of that pile, as it were. And in fact, you mentioned all these organizations that were a part of the March on Washington. The fact of the matter is, King was raising tons of money, not just for the SCLC. He really was raised. Not a penny of it dropped into his pocket. He was raising this for organizations all over the place. And so, so anyway, that's some background.
One of you, I think it was you, Lucas, mentioned that there was outrage when they learned that one of the speeches had been vetted by the White House.
Yeah.
John Lewis's speech.
Right.
Were all the speeches that day vetted? Was King's?
I don't know.
Yeah.
King's was gone over, and there was a real concern, I think, among other things, not just for content, but also for time. And I know that his speech was very methodically, almost every paragraph until he kind of breaks free at the end in this rhetorical, more memorable part, was specifically designed to reach a particular audience. And so I know it was gone through multiple times, and I do think there was such concern about this coming off well and no one kind of going off. And I guess if King, if it hadn't gone, if the last part of his speech had been less well received, it might have there might have been a different. We might think differently of it, because I'm not sure that it was a welcome thing to just set your script aside and go. But if anyone could have done it, I imagine he had the standing to. But that's my understanding.
This theme of I have a dream today. Did King draw this from anything else, or is this kind of sui generis?
I'm not sure about that. Jay, do you know anything about that?
The actual I have a dream. It's not the first time he delivered this particular speech.
Right.
So the actual words, there is, and we can get into this as well. The speech is just brimming with biblical references, and this very very powerful line about drawing. Where is it? It says about the stone of hope. It is, yeah, he says, with this faith, it's after he's in the midst of the I have a dream portion. He goes, with this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. As best as anyone can tell, this comes from a very complicated story in the book of Daniel, where Daniel is having a dream. And within that dream, this stone is hewn out of the mountain, and this stone that's taken out that's seemingly insignificant builds into its own massive force that takes over everything. And this it's very obscure, and yet if you read it sort of with that context, you can't help, especially he's a preacher, right? He is very steeped in the biblical tradition, and this particular dream of Daniel is very possibly an inspiration.
Okay. Let's see. Dan Shaner asks, does this speech show that King agrees or disagrees with Frederick Douglass's metaphor of the country as a river featured in What to the Slave is the 4th of July?
No, I teach that speech once a year, and comparing the country to a river does not come to my mind. So I'd have to hear more about that. What's the exact question?
Here it is literally. Does this show King agrees or disagrees with Frederick Douglass's metaphor of the country as a river from What to the Slave is the 4th of July? Pretty much just as I said it.
Okay. I can't answer that specific possible allusion there, or even just he may be suggesting it's not an allusion. Just does he agree with Douglas?
Dan, would you mind putting through a message clarifying what you mean by that question?
Yeah, I'll just do it briefly here. That's one of Frederick Douglass's most famous speeches, delivered July 5th, 1852, at a time where he just shifted his opinion about the United States Constitution. Prior to 1852, Douglass was a Garrisonian abolitionist who believed that the Constitution was pro-slavery. And he shifted when he started editing his own newspaper and was reading more capaciously from guys like Gerrit Smith and Lysander Spooner, who argued that the Constitution was actually pro-liberty. And so we see the first flowering of Douglass making that argument about the Constitution, that the Constitution could actually be a lever to emancipate slaves, not the thing that's enshrining or further entrenching slavery into the American fabric. And so Douglass in that speech has all praise for the founders and only quickly elides to the fact that they own slaves. His target is his current generation. He goes after them hammer and tong. But the founders, he says, they were great men. They were heroes. They risked it all. And he sees the Constitution as, what does he call it? He says it's a glorious liberty document, and it contains eternal truths. And so that Frederick Douglass, I think, yes, King would agree with that Frederick Douglass. And he would also agree with the Douglass that was criticizing his current generation, people who were bragging that they were descendants of Washington, but they were continuing to do nothing to emancipate the enslaved black man. Martin Luther King would agree with with Frederick Douglass, that it's the current generation, especially what he criticizes in the letter from Birmingham jail is the white moderate. These are the guys that are slowing down progress, and these are the guys that he just assumed not spend more time trying to pass legislation rather than just showing up in speeches.
Okay. Uh, Donnie asks, so given what Lucas has stated, King, I think he means here, may have been riding on the backs of others. Do you think this could be that he was charismatic and very eloquent speaker, that he was in the limelight? I'm not sure I understand the question. I've asked for clarification here. I mean, let's ask this: is to what extent is King riding on the backs of those who came before him?
Well, another thing to bear in mind about King that's easy to forget is that he's still in his early 30s.
Mm.
He's a young man. He was a young man when he died. So that doesn't say he wasn't capable of original thought, or that he was not in himself a genuinely insightful, and he was I think a bona fide intellectual. But I also think he was incredibly. One of his keys was he was bringing together a tremendous, a wide variety of different figures. I think one of the, I'm not sure you can understand this speech without understanding Gandhi. Gandhi's legacy and his influence, and he was very candid about that in terms of not just his strategy of nonviolence, but some of the philosophical underpinnings of nonviolence, and he saw as its effect. And King had not just what didn't this doesn't just resonate with him intellectually, but he had seen how it had worked out way back to the Salt March. In fact, there was a thought that the March on Washington should be a march from Birmingham to Washington that was much more like the Salt March, that was going to be drawing that kind of attention. So he was, I think he was relatively generous in his acknowledgement of some of the influences that others had had on him, but he also needs to be given credit for tailoring it to his own time.
Okay, Lucas.
Yeah, I would only add that I think that's all true. He, like many a preacher, like many a speaker, would also borrow from other preachers. And I can't cite chapter and verse here, but those who dig a little deeper on this matter, and there have been a lot of books written about this one speech, let alone about King's life, that have made those connections where you can look at some other, in particular, other black preachers that King was familiar with, certain locutions that they used that King would borrow. And so Ralph Ellison once said, "Writers write from other writers." So King, he speaks from other speakers. So it would not surprise me that there are particular phrases even cadences in this speech that he borrowed from other preachers and speakers.
Okay. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the how this speech was received in the aftermath. Did this speech move the needle, as they say?
Well, a great tragedy happened after this speech. Is the bombing of the church where the four girls were attending Sunday school died. That happened in early September, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. So if it moved at least one needle that it moved a needle of the extremist element in this country, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a major gathering of the Ku Klux Klan just days after this on Stone Mountain, of course, which is referenced in the speech. And of course, the Klan was already in its sort of third major iteration, having to do with the ascendancy of the civil rights movement and the anniversary, as John mentioned, of the Civil War. But and also sort of the growing sense that there was a profound violation of civil rights, which of course he mentions pretty directly in his talk of the lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification from, of course, George Wallace. So I think Lucas is probably right in terms of moving the needle. I think it. I don't know if the speech did this, but the march did, and some of these events that followed from it witnessed a splintering of the civil rights movement and a real strong counterattack. Now, whether anyone was persuaded by the march or the speech to actually move on the legislation, it's hard to say because, of course, the legislation comes. Many feel as Johnson's need to sort of do this in memory of what would be a slain President Kennedy, which would also happen later this same year, only a few months later. So it's hard. There's so many other factors. It's hard to know whether the march in general, the speech in particular, did anything.
How did white America receive the speech? For instance, what did the press think about it?
Yikes! I don't know.
Yeah, I did read somewhere that there were some. Maybe the New York Times was one that, in terms of all the speeches of the day, they not only picked up on the fact that King's was the most memorable, but they picked up on the "I Have a Dream" pretty quickly, that was going to be the thing that retained. Not all newspapers did. There was one report that I read that indicated that King was not even mentioned when the event was reported on. So the speech is so singular in our imagination; it's hard to imagine that anything else happened that day. But again, that's not to say that it was people weren't moved by it. I know Kennedy himself was thrilled by it. One of the things the participants in the march or up on the stage pretty directly went from there to the White House for a reception, and Kennedy was visibly moved and talked about. I think he said a hell of a speech, and was struck by Kennedy himself was struck by the powerful rhetoric. So.
Yeah. Larry Fata asked a question a little while ago about the personal relationship between King and Malcolm X. Was there a mutual respect or mutual animosity?
What little I know about that is there was some correspondence between them, but it wouldn't be. I mean, there was no room in King's heart for animosity towards anyone. I don't think, and I would say not for Malcolm either. The few letters that I've read were very cordial between them. But King, like X, was a busy man, and it wasn't, as I said, as far as I know, they only met in person one time that summer of '63 to listen in on the debates over the Civil Rights Bill. But they were both, operating on separate tracks, especially given the fact that as long as Malcolm X was the spokesman for the Nation of Islam, which was arguing for as much practicable separation from white people as possible, because they actually thought that judgment from God was going to be visited upon whites, and so do whatever you can not to mix with whites, and not just even don't marry. It's don't shop in their stores, don't go to their schools. In some cases, don't even speak their language. Right? They spoke Arabic and taught their children Arabic. They were never considered an orthodox sect of Islam, as any Muslim will tell you. Elijah Muhammad has a very much a Baldurized version of Islam, which I think bothered Malcolm. I think Malcolm knew even before he left the Nation of Islam that he wanted something that was more traditional Islam, and he actually converted to to become a Sunni Muslim when he left the Nation of Islam. But back to your question, I don't know that the communication was very often, and they never made a point of meeting up with each other.
Jay, can you add anything to that?
I think, I'm sure I'll defer to Lucas's sense of this. Well, one thing I have read is that I think that the contrast between their views and their concerns and really their heart impulses sometimes overdone, and they shared a tremendous amount in common. And just going back to those two really interesting paragraphs. One where King is emphasizing that, in fact, he hasn't been co-opted, and they're not haven't been taken in by the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, contrasted with the later one where he's like pushing back against probably the militancy he saw rising in the likes of Malcolm X. In the midst of that, he really does offer what seems to me about the sternest and the most and maybe the most moving part of the speech, where he says, "There will neither and those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual." So there's a sense in which he understands and is sympathetic to those who have had it, and he continues on. There will neither be rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. So that's strong language.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if maybe we could bring Marcus Garvey's appeal to the soul of white America into this very briefly. What does bringing this document in help us to illuminate either about King's speech or Malcolm X's?
Well, there is this similarity. Both King and Garvey, I would argue, are appealing to the nation's conscience, right? It's a word that Garvey repeats in his editorial, and it's clearly what King is doing, giving a talk at the nation's capital on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He's appealing to the good-heartedness of America. King would not be hopeful if it was the case that the vast majority of white Americans hated Black people. That would be, again, we would be having a completely different conversation. And so, on the one hand, both Garvey and King, to promote progress for Blacks, recognize a need to appeal to the conscience of white Americans. The difference, the massive difference, the obvious difference, of course, is where they're headed. Garvey thinks racial prejudice in the United States is so bad that there is no hope for Black Americans in America, especially for the best of Black Americans. And in this case, he echoes statements by W.E.B. Du Bois on that subject. And so for both Du Bois and for Garvey, because prejudice is so pervasive, they have to come up with a racial separatist means to accomplish a particular end. For Garvey, the best of all worlds is, or if whites aren't going to change their minds about being bigots, then they should at least not take for granted all these years that Blacks have helped build the United States. And if you're not going to let them reap those fruit, reap that fruit, then at least help them find a nation of their own somewhere else. And of course, for Garvey, that's what he considers the motherland, right? Back to Africa.
Yeah.
Whereas King definitely sees the future. He's hopeful for the future, and his future is an integrated future. The beloved community is Black and white together, and Garvey was willing to take help from whites, but he's not willing to build a future with whites.
Jay, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that it is really striking to read Garvey's strong language opposing the doctrine of social equality as something that seems absolutely ludicrous. I will say, and this doesn't come out as much in the "I Have a Dream" speech, but I think King had learned to be sensitive in 1963, not to overplay talk of social equality. I think that he made a comment. He was at an earlier time before he had. Now I think he may have had some white girlfriends sort of on the side, but he was persuaded to not. This wasn't going to be good for his cause to date. So we're looking to be brothers, not brothers-in-law, with white men, which I thought was kind of a jarring thing. So even though implicitly he's very much advocating for a kind of political equality, there was an acknowledgement that he didn't want to push push this too far. So that would be some similarities. But in terms of his aims and his means, they're really strikingly different, which speaks to the difference between the 1920s and the 1960s.
Well, John Juan Daniels gives us, I think, the perfect question to close on. He asks, looking today at the current racial climate, the Starbucks incident for a recent example, can it be said that King's dream has yet to be realized?
I'll let you take a crack at that first, Joe.
I think so. Of course, it's hard to live in sort of the current state of seemingly rising animosity. I mean, King very specifically addresses police brutality in this speech, and this is an issue that is as relevant, if not more relevant, than it was when he wrote it in 1963. So I think there was a poll taken, I think maybe it was right around the same one in 2008, and they listed a lot of different options about do you think that the dream has been fulfilled, and an equal number of people said it absolutely has and it absolutely has not. It was 1% each. So Americans broadly acknowledge, and there was some debate, when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, there was a lot of talk the dream was fulfilled. I think that was maybe not exactly, if you read the speech, not that King would have thought that was a bad thing, but exactly what he had in mind.
Lucas.
Yeah, I would add that as long as we're still, we still have affirmative action. So that means in terms of government policy, we're still teaching citizens to pay attention to race, even though the claim is that we're paying attention to race to help, not to harm. But that, of course, that's a debatable proposition. With the emphasis on identity on campuses and talking about microaggressions and safe spaces and where is it allowable for people of color on campus to have a space where whites aren't allowed at certain times of the day, at a time when we're emphasizing what some people would call multiculturalism. It seems that adopting policies that are expressly teaching people that race matters, that's the most important part of who you are, not your religion, not your politics, but your race. In that sense, to that extent, we're children of Malcolm X, and we're children of the Black Power movement, where they said race is the most important thing to think about. And so we haven't, I don't think, at least this portion of King's dream has become reality, simply because we haven't taken seriously enough, the most famous line next to "Let Freedom Ring" of the speech, which was, right, where they will to live in a country where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The problem, though, is if you study King, not just this King, but the King in his later years, in fact, beginning in the very next year, where he published a book called Chaos or Community, King starts making he places a much greater emphasis on skin than he does on character. Ironically enough, near the end of his life, he wants people to think about blacks as victims. He wants people to think about blacks, that the most important thing to know about blacks is they suffer. And that's a very different message than I think we see in King here, saying we need to pay attention to people's character and trust that teaching that to our children is the most important way for us to move past the color line to a place where we can see race, but race won't matter.
Well, we're going to have that be the last word. I want to thank both of our panelists, Jay and Lucas, as well as all of you participants for your questions. Thank you. Just a reminder you will be receiving an email with a link for a certificate of participation. Watch for that in your inbox. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center. These are also offered as part of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. Both Jay and Lucas regularly teach in that program. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. And you can help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link that you will be receiving by email next week. Please share that with your colleagues as well as on social media. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be held on Wednesday, May 16th. I should let you know this will be our final webinar of the 2017-18 season. After that, we will take a hiatus for a couple of months and return in late August. Our subject on May 16th will be Ronald Reagan's speech, A Time for Choosing. And at that time, I'll be joined by Dr. Stephen Knott of the United States Naval War College and Dr. Gregory Schneider of Emporia State University. The recommended readings for that webinar have been posted, so we hope to see you all back here on May 16th. Thanks again and have a wonderful evening.